Hi guys, I'm Meg. Welcome to my channel, even though there's not really a channel because this is my first video. I wanted to try doing a true crime series just because I find these cases so interesting and I personally love putting them on the background, especially when I'm driving to school. It passes the time and the cases are so interesting. I am heavily inspired by Bella Fury, who's also a YouTuber. A lot of her cases are based in Australia, so I wanted to try to shed some light on cases that are in my area, which is Southern California. Please excuse, I'm very new to this. I'm going to try to make it as captivating as possible. So without further ado, let's get into the first case. So our first case is the Black Dahlia, which has been unsolved for the past 60 years, and it is labeled one of the most infamous unsolved cases in the world. Our story starts with Elizabeth Short, who is a 22-year-old living in Hollywood, similar to me. She is 5'6", 120 pounds, with black hair and green eyes. Her family describes her as being beautiful and charming and just a ray of light. She has been aspiring to be a Hollywood actress ever since she was a teenager. She was born in Boston, where she moved to various places such as Medford and Florida before coming to California. She was born on July 29th in 1924 in Boston, Massachusetts, to Cleo Short and Phoebe Sawyer. She is the third of 5 daughters, and in 1927 she moved to Portland, Maine, and Medford all in 1 year. Medford is where she spent most of her life. Her father had a job of building miniature golf courses, which is super cool. And then in 1929, the stock market unfortunately crashed and they lost all their savings and became broke. The next year, in 1930, they found his car abandoned on a bridge just over the Charles River below, and the police just assumed he had committed suicide despite not finding a body. So his mother, who thought he was dead, decided to get a job as a bookkeeper with her 5 daughters in a small apartment. Elizabeth had very severe bronchitis and asthma attacks, so she underwent surgery at a very young age at 15 years old, and the doctors suggested she move to a warmer climate, so that's where she moved to Florida and spent a lot of her times with family and friends. She also had another medical diagnosis, which we'll get into later. Then she dropped out of Bedford High School in her sophomore year. And in 1942, her mother received a letter from random person, but it wasn't random, and it was her dead husband saying, "Oh, sorry, I've been MIA for a very long time. I've actually just been living in California, and by the way, I'm alive." So what a surprise. And so she decided at 18 years old to move to California with her dad. And get this, she hasn't seen him since she was 6 years old. And a lot could change. And I think a lot says about someone who fakes their death and leaves their entire family to go some random place and then be like, "Oh, I'm going to come back in your lives." So her father was working at a naval ship on Mare Island in the San Francisco Bay Area. And this is where her refound relationship with her father came to an end because they were arguing a lot. Some people say he was abusive, but there is no definitive evidence for that. So she took off in 1943 in January and decided to work at a base exchange for the Army first as her first job. And she left soon after because she was actually being abused by her sergeant. And then in September 23rd, 1943, she moved to Santa Barbara, where she was arrested for underage drinking. Now, these two facts are actually going to come in handy later on in the case. So after the authorities sent her to Medford, she decided to return to Florida, where in Florida she met Major Matthew Michael Gordon Jr., who was an Army Air Force officer who was training to be deployed to China for World War II. And Elizabeth told her friends that he actually proposed to her through letter, but before she had a chance to reply or anything, it wasn't like today where we could just text, or I guess you wouldn't text, you would be in person. He was in a war though. Before she had a chance to reply, he actually died in a plane crash a week before the end of the war, which is just very unfortunate. And in July 1946, she relocated to Los Angeles to visit Lieutenant Joseph Gordon Flanking, which she knew from Florida. Now, this is where Elizabeth will spend the last 6 months of her life in Southern California, Los Angeles. This is where she got a job, and she worked as a waitress and rented a room behind the Florentine Gardens nightclub on Hollywood Boulevard. She made friends very easily with both sexes. She was very friendly. Her typical day was going to work as a waitress and then ended the night at a cocktail bar or a night sports bar. There were some people who thought she had been a prostitute, but that was proven wrong, as she actually had a congenital defect that physically did not allow her to have sexual intercourse. That was what I was implying earlier, when she also had the surgery. So she also had a lot of male friends in jazz clubs, and she was seen to have been dating many men at one time and crashing on their couches from time to time. So this is where we really get into the case. On January 9th, 1947, she had just returned from a trip with Robert Manley, a 25-year-old married salesman she was dating. So Manley dropped her off at the hotel, and she was supposed to meet her sister, who was visiting from Boston. And some people, the last few moments of her life, saw her using the lobby telephone. They also saw her, this is where she was the last seen, at the Crown Grill Cocktail Lounge, which was just less than a mile from the hotel. She was last seen before her horrible tragedy, wearing a black suit, cardigan-style, fluffy white blouse, and high suede high heels. On January 15th, 1947, at 11 a.m., Betty Bersinger and her 3-year-old daughter were just taking a stroll in Los Angeles, where they found the body of a naked woman sliced clean in half at the waist. Immediately, appalled, she ran to a nearby house and called the police. She was found just a few feet from the sidewalk, and she looked like a mannequin the way she was positioned. Her body was drained of blood. She was very clean, and despite very clear cuts and mutilations on her body, there was no blood at all. It was almost as if her body was washed. The Daily Police Bulletin Special described the subject found brutally murdered and body severed and mutilated. And the most prominent aspect to her body was that there were 3-inch gashes on the corners of her mouth, kind of like the Joker. It was just very not a great scene to take a stroll by. Now I'm going to get into the autopsy if this is not something you want to hear. There is quite a bit of detailed stuff about her body. You could skip to this. I love it when they do that. This part of the video, and then I'll just skip the autopsy. So the autopsy was performed on January 16th, a day after, performed by Frederick Newbar. Elizabeth was 22 years old at the time, and it had been determined that she's been dead for 10 hours before the discovery. So at 1 a.m., early evening or early morning, there were cuts on her thighs and breasts, and there were portions of her flesh that were just clearly sliced away. Her lower part of her body was found 1 foot away from her upper body, and her intestines were tucked under her buttocks. Her corpse was positioned with the hands over her head and elbows at a 90-degree angle with her legs spread apart. The first person to arrive at the scene was not police, but reporter Aggie Underwood. There were ligature markings on her ankles, wrists, and neck, and a regular loss of tissue on her right breast. There were superficial lacerations on her right forearm, left upper arm, and lower left side of her chest. This does seem to me that she was trying to protect herself by, self-defense, raising up her arms, and that's why there was some superficial lacerations on her arms. She was found completely cut in half. This was actually a medical technique taught in 1930 called a Hemi Corporectomy, where you remove the lower half by transecting the lumbar spine between the second and third lumbar vertebrae. And then they sever the intestines at the duodenum. There was very little bruising on the incision line, so it suggested it was performed after death, and it was also suggested that it was performed by someone who knew surgery. The skull was not fractured, but there was bruising in the subarachnoid space on the right side, meaning that there were blows to the right side of her face, and that is actually what the cause of death was, cerebral hemorrhage, and her anal canal was dilated 1 3/4, suggesting she was raped, but there was no trace of sperm inside of her. Now that search was conducted by the LAPD, but they contacted the FBI shortly after because they botched the fingerprints in transit. They took her fingerprints and they blurred it. Like, they just weren't very careful with the evidence, and they sent it in transit, and they needed help, so they contacted the FBI. Now, she was named the Black Dahlia shortly after by the press due to her black clothing that they found shortly after. And in this time period, the Blue Dahlia was a very popular movie, and so they just changed the Blue Dahlia to the Black Dahlia. Now, her prints, when they did get the right prints by the FBI, were found 2 times. The first time was when she applied for that army camp that we talked about earlier, and the second time was when she was arrested at Santa Barbara PD for underage drinking, and they actually had her mugshot. So it was very certain it was Elizabeth because they had her fingerprints and they had a picture of her body and her actual mugshot. Now, this is where a very excessive manhunt began. The FBI began record-checking all the potential suspects and interviewed people across the nation. Now, at this time period, there was no law for recording sexual assaults in the area, so nowadays, that if there was a murder or a crime, we could just pull up a list of people that could be suspects, because if they had done a sexual assault in the past, we will get their fingerprints. So this would narrow down the suspect list, but at this time there was no law for that. So there wasn't quite a big suspect list. So they pretty much had nothing to work with. They did suspect someone who had dissection skills, such as a doctor or a surgeon. So they checked on the students at USC Medical School, but nothing came back. That's where her body was found near, but all the students came clean and they had alibis. The sole witness of the murder reported seeing a black sedan parked in the area that early morning, but that's all there was. That was the only witness. Now, Los Angeles at this time period had rising levels of crime. It was the post-war period, so there was increasing freedoms for women, and more women were coming from different countries to make it in Hollywood. A quote from a newspaper article at the time period when the case emerged said, "An example of what happens when you leave the safe confines of your family and husband." What I learned in school at this time period, like 1920s, 1930s time period, was women were supposed to only be in the kitchen or taking care of the children, basically staying in their home. Now, what happened to Elizabeth was very unfortunate, but it didn't happen because she was just being herself and going to the bar. It just happened to her, and it was an unfortunate accident. It wasn't because women left their husband. Our first suspect is Robert Manley. They did apprehend him, but he had a very strong alibi and was cleared shortly after. Robert Manley, as we know, is the man who dropped him off, who was married, and she was dating him, and he dropped her off at the hotel, and that's the last person who really saw her that she knew. Now, this is where it kind of gets a little creepy and eerie. There was a series of letters that the newspaper press received from the killer. On January 21st, 1946, someone claiming to be the killer phoned James Richardson, the editor of the newspaper company, The Examiner, called him up saying, "Congratulations on covering the case." He said he planned on turning himself in soon, but wanted the police to pursue him further, and said to expect some souvenirs of Beth Short in the mail, Beth being Elizabeth. On January 24th, another anonymous letter came in, and it had fingerprints, but it didn't match to anyone they had in the database. And there was cut out newspaper letters reading "Heaven is here" on the front of the letter. And the next day after this letter, her birth certificate, photos, business cards, and an address book, which we'll get into later, and a very bizarre letter was in the letter that he sent. The letters were cleaned with gasoline, so he tried not to leave any fingerprints, but he did. But it was similar to how he killed and cleaned Elizabeth's body, so the police just were sure it was the killer. And so there were fingerprints that were lifted off the letter and sent to the Federal Bureau for investigation, but again, the police botched the fingerprints and it could not be properly analyzed because it got smeared in transit. Another letter sent said, "The Los Angeles Examiner and Los Angeles Papers. Here is Dahlia's belongings. Letter to follow." The same day, a handbag and black suede shoes were reported on a garbage can near where the body is found. And as we know, Elizabeth left with a handbag and black suede shoes. Later, they were confirmed to be hers. Again, no fingerprints because they were cleaned with gasoline. On January 26th, another letter read, "Here it is, turning in Wednesday, January 29th, 10 a.m. Had my fun at the police, Black Dahlia, Avenger." And it named a location where he would turn himself in. The police went to the place where he would turn himself in and no one came. Later that day, they received another letter saying, "Have changed my mind. You would not give me a square deal. Dahlia killing was justified." Now, interpret these letters as you will, but what I'm hearing is this guy doesn't know what the heck he's doing. He's constantly going flip-flop, flip-flop. And he said, "You would not give me a square deal. Obviously, we were not going to give you a square deal because you murdered somebody." And he also said her killing was justified. I don't know what she might have done or have not even done, but there is no justification for killing someone. There was a last letter that was received that said, "I will give up on Dahlia killing if I get 10 years. Don't try to find me." On March 14th, this was not a letter, but there was a suicide note scrawled in pencil, tucked into a pile of men's clothing on Breeze Avenue. First of all, how do you find a letter that's tucked into clothes on a random pile on a random street? But it read, "To whom it may concern, I have waited for the police to capture me for the Black Dahlia killing, but have not. I am too much of a coward to turn myself in, so this is the best way out for me. I couldn't help myself for that or this. Sorry, Mary." They never found out who Mary is. They never found out who the killer is. So this suicide note was almost, another piece of dead evidence for them. The person who found it was just a person walking by, and they gave it to John Dillion, who was a lifeguard, and then they notified the LAPD. A total of 750 investigators worked on this case, and there was a $10,000 reward for any information regarding Elizabeth's killer or anything regarding her at all. Now, $10,000 then is equivalent to $115,000 in 2021. So many people thinking they might get part of the reward came forward with false confessions. And there was a total of 500 false confessions. And John P. St. John, a detective on the case, said, "It is amazing how many people offered up their relative as the killer just for some money." The next suspect was Mark Hamson, who actually was the owner of the address book I said we come back to. His name was plop right on the front of the book. He was a wealthy nightclub owner and theater owner. Elizabeth was friends with him. She sometimes crashed at his place, but he did have a very strong alibi, so he was cleared. He was actually the person who confirmed Elizabeth's shoe and purse were hers in the alley. Some people say Elizabeth refused sexual advances from him, but like I said, he was cleared. He had an alibi. The LAPD interviewed 150 men and 75 men from the book. One of the men, including Martin Lewis, who was Elizabeth's friend, but again, he had another person who had an alibi. He was in Oregon visiting his father-in-law. Now, LAPD checked storm drains, abandoned structures, and the LA River, but found nothing. The media, as you can imagine, blew up on this case. It was a sensation due to location being in showbiz capital. It really instilled fear in Los Angeles as a cautionary tale for young women and warning young women not to be movie stars. Now, police actually developed a very close relationship with the press, as one would find a fresh lead and exclusives would just be exchanged very fast. A newspaper article read, when the first headlines came out about the murder, it sold more copies than papers about the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Now, the newspapers painted out in the beginning Elizabeth to be the innocent damsel in distress, but she quickly went from virgin to vamp as Elizabeth's history kind of came out, and unfortunately they really shamed her relationship with men. That's when people made the assumption she was a prostitute, and they were saying almost like she deserved it due to her sleeping around, but like we know, she can't actually sleep with them. Now, Elizabeth had known at least 50 men and was dating about 25 men in the last 60 days past her death, and she was labeled as the teaser of men. Now, this is just the most messed up part. I mean, there's a lot of messed up parts of this case, but this was just so sad, and this is just a terrible person. William Randolph was the first reporter to want to get the first scoop, wanted to get information on Elizabeth that couldn't just be found by looking at her from the past 6 months. So he called her mother up in Boston and told her, "Hi, your daughter had just won a beauty contest. Tell me more about her." And he got all the information about her. Obviously, her mother was very excited, very happy. And then he was like, "Oh, by the way, I'm just joking. Your daughter didn't win a beauty contest. She's actually just dead, and I just wanted information. Bye-bye." And hung up. And if I was a mother, my gosh, that just sucks. Anyways, by this time, the case went cold, and unfortunately went cold, and John P. St. John, a detective on the case, said, "The combination of faulty witnesses and lack of hard evidence surrounding the case greatly hindered its progress, and despite numerous allegations and leads over the years, the Black Dahlia's killer was never found." So now let's get into theories. In 2013, the Black Dahlia case returned to the headlines, and Paul Dostie, who was a retired sergeant, author Steve Hodel, and Buster, a police dog who had a keen smell of decomposing flesh, conducted the reinvestigation. Now, there were quite a bit of movies and books that were loosely based off this case, one of which from Steve Hodel, the author that went in the reinvestigation, knew/thought his father to be the killer for the longest time. So they actually found evidence against his father, Dr. George Hill Hodel, which, like we know, the killer had to have been someone who was a surgeon or a doctor or a medical student. So his son decided to do the reinvestigation on him, and they conducted a house search where the dog had actually smelled decomposing flesh in the basement. Now, soil samples were sent to the lab for testing, but that's all the information I got on this theory. Maybe it's just taking a long time. Maybe they found nothing and it just went cold again. Other evidence was that there was an old recording of the conversation between the doctor and an unknown person. And it said, "Supposed I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary because she's dead." Dead meaning he killed her, dead meaning she just died. We're not quite sure. The next theory is that there was a former resident, Los Angeles resident known as Leslie Dillion, who was living in Florida, but he contacted the LAPD to say that he had an acquaintance who he thought murdered Elizabeth. Now, Leslie was diagnosed with a split personalities disorder by a psychiatrist, so the police just thought it was him, and he was blaming his other half to have been the murderer. So psychiatrist Dr. John Paul D. River lured him out to the West, where they had a group of officers try to extract a confession, but it turns out he was talking about a real person and not just his other half. And it was a real person, but they came back innocent and was cleared very quickly. The next theory is that there is a link between her murders and the Cleveland, Ohio torso murders, which happened just a few years before. Jack Anderson Wilson, who was a prior torso murder suspect, was arrested for the murders, and they were going to put the murders on him and say he did murder Elizabeth. However, he died in a fire before they were able to do that. The last theory is that in February 19, 1947, Jean French was possibly connected to Elizabeth's murder. Her body was discovered in West LA and found nude and badly beaten, with lipstick written on her belly that read FUBD. Now, they thought BD stood for Black Dahlia, but it actually read FUPD, PD meaning police department. So the aftermath of Elizabeth's murder was that just 2 weeks after, Republican State Assemblyman C. John Field was prompted by the case to introduce a bill calling for the information of sex offender registry. Now, we use this to this day, the sex offender registry, and the state of California had to register sex offenders, and this is how a lot of cases are solved, with just narrowing down the suspect list with this registry, which is great of him to do, and, at least one good thing came out of her murder. Now, like I said, there was quite a bit of movies and television specials that were about her murder. One was written by Stephen Hodelick, we talked about, who he thought his own father was the Black Dahlia murder. The second was John Gregory Dunne, who wrote True Confessions in 1977. James Elroy wrote The Black Dahlia in 1987. And lastly, the movie called Daddy Was the Black Dahlia Killer in 1995. Now, that's all I have in this case. Unfortunately, Elizabeth's murder has never been solved to this day. Like I said, I'm very new to this, and I hope this gets some positive feedback, and I'm very sorry for being unnatural and awkward and nervous, because I am. But I do hope to do more cases in the future. This was very interesting to me, and I hope it was to you. Thank you so much for watching. Please thumbs up and subscribe. Bye.